The footage you're currently watching wasn't shot on a Blackmagic, it wasn't shot on a Sony A7 or an Arri Alexa, but it was shot on this £300 camcorder that I bought on eBay secondhand. A couple of years ago, I got the opportunity to make a short film in New York. I didn't have much time to prepare, and there'd only be 3 of us on the crew. I wanted to get this real kind of handheld, spontaneous kind of look to the film, and a lot of the shooting would be in very busy parts of New York, very public spaces, and it was, near impossible to kind of take a big rig into these areas. Originally, I started to play around with my Blackmagic Pocket Cinema Camera 4K and try and find ways to reduce handheld shake to make it possible to shoot the way I wanted to shoot in these environments without drawing too much attention. But after doing some tests in the UK, I realised it was just impossible. Earlier that year, I'd bought a camcorder secondhand on eBay to capture memories with friends and family. Also just for the nostalgia, because when I was younger and kind of getting into filmmaking, me and my brother always would shoot on camcorders. I was really impressed with how it looked for the videos that I'd been shooting with friends, but using it to shoot a short film and going for sort of high-end cinematography was a completely different matter. I did a few tests in the UK, was very surprised with the results, and then decided to take the gamble, go out to New York and use it as one of the main cameras for the film. I'm happy to say the gamble paid off. Whilst it took a bit of work to get my head around the best settings to shoot with and the best ways to grade the footage, I ended up with something I'm really pleased with. And I think it really shifted my perspective and kind of opened up a new world of possibilities and kind of made me question what is cinematic. And so I thought I'd make a video just unpacking the process and basically showing you how you can take this camcorder or any similar camcorder and basically get cinematic shots with it. So let's start with the camcorder. If you go online, you'll find that eBay is flooded with hundreds and thousands of camcorders secondhand, varying in different models, prices, things like this. If you're not sure where to start, I'd recommend looking for something that shoots in 4K, has optional manual controls on it, and has a good lens with an optical zoom. In my case, I got the Panasonic HC-VX 870. It had everything I needed. It shot in UHD 4K, which was good enough for my purposes. It had manual controls on the side, and had a really nice Leica lens built in. And this had an optical zoom going from 49mm aperture f4 to 81mm aperture 1.8. It became clear to me early on that one of the real pros of shooting on a camcorder, especially for a project like this one, was the automatic settings. Now, I'd used automatic settings on SLR cameras like the GH5 and stuff like that before, but taking into account that camcorders are purpose-built to just be kind of point and shoot, the automatic settings on these blew me away. The exposure, white balance, focus, everything like that seemed seamless. And of course, from time to time, I'd encounter an issue. But on the whole, I was blown away by just out of the box how good this thing was. And I don't know if I'm ashamed or not to admit, but actually, on the final film, I think we only turned the manual settings on once. Obviously, it's ideal to have as much control as possible. And when you have the time and the crew, I think you should always shoot with manual settings. But at the same time, having a camera at your disposal that you can really trust, and you know that if you turn on the auto settings, it's pretty much going to get it right most of the time, is a lifesaver. Now, whilst you can get camcorders with bigger sensors, in the case of this one, the sensor is pretty tiny, and if you're used to working with a cinema camera, it's quite daunting at first to kind of get your head around. Now, outside in a well-lit environment, most of the time the shots are going to be absolutely fine, and maybe some minimal noise reduction will be needed, but beyond that, I find it very workable. However, I will say, in full disclosure, if you're shooting indoors in a dimly lit area or you're shooting at night, it does become pretty unusable pretty quickly, as you can see. But for the film we were shooting, this camcorder was perfectly adequate. Almost all the shots that we needed to get were outside in well-lit areas during the day. Had we been shooting indoors or in poorly lit areas, I think I definitely would have reconsidered the camera choice. And if for some reason I still wanted to use a camcorder in that situation, I'd definitely look at ones with bigger sensors. So I've got this camcorder, let's have a look in the settings, and I'm going to show you everything I used and the way I set this up to shoot cinematic footage with it. So let's start by setting up the format and resolution we'll be shooting in. Under format, I set the camera to 4K MP4. While MP4 may not be the ideal shooting codec, it was the best choice on this camera for my needs. Next, I made sure the image stabilization was turned on. on the Panasonic. This is called OIS, and I have to say this is where I was really blown away by this camera. When shooting handheld on these focal lengths, camera shake is inevitable, but just having that stabilization really made these shots usable when, if we'd been using a cinema camera without stabilization, I just don't think we could have done it. Next up, let's look at the manual settings. I found that using the auto settings across the board when shooting with a pretty set focal range is actually pretty flawless for me. But in shots with lighting changes, it's important to keep an eye on the exposure settings. If you don't know where to start, turn on auto, see what the camera suggests, then turn on manual exposure and lock it off until you're done with your shot. This just means that when it comes to grading, you won't have a shot that requires a lot of automation because it keeps changing exposure or white balance on you. Next up is the zoom. The last thing that we need to do is make sure the camera's zoom mode is only on optical and not on digital. With a lot of camcorders, the extra digital zoom is on by default, so we're going to want to turn that off. To briefly explain why this is important, our optical zoom is the actual lens changing focal length inside the camera, as if we were to manually zoom in on the lens. But the digital zoom is the camcorder just trying to extend this by zooming into the image artificially whilst trying to reduce noise. As it does this, the image quality sharply drops, so we want to switch this off and make sure that we only have optical on to ensure we retain resolution and quality. So now we have all our settings dialed in, it's time to shoot. And right off the bat, I'm going to give you one of the biggest tips and something which really makes a night and day difference in my opinion, and that is, when possible, film zoomed in. Now what do I mean by this? I always like to say that what makes something cinematic isn't just the technical attributes of it. However, when we're talking about cinematic convention and getting a kind of general cinematic look, one of the first things that usually comes to people's mind is shallow depth of field. Now, if you don't know what shallow depth of field is, it's when the background is blurry and the subject is in focus. This really helps draw the audience's attention into what's happening, be it the performance or whatever the focus of that particular shot is. Now, for shallow depth of field, we need two things ideally. We need a wide aperture on the lens, which means it's open, it's letting in a lot of light, and we also need, ideally, a large sensor. As we discussed earlier, we don't have the large sensor on this camcorder, but when we're zoomed in, we do have a fairly wide aperture, 1.8, which is pretty ideal. Essentially, how the camcorder works is as we zoom in and the focal length changes, the aperture widens to account for the exposure change of that zoom. With a cinema camera or an SLR camera, we obviously have the option to change out to prime lenses with different apertures. So if we wanted to shoot with 1.8 on a 50mm or a 75mm, we could do that. But on this camera, as we have a fixed lens, we're obviously limited in what we can do. But if we're to zoom all the way in on this lens, we're essentially shooting on an 81mm lens with a 1.8 aperture, and that's wide enough to get some really nice depth of field. The best way to demonstrate this is just to show you. So here we go. This is the camera zoomed all the way out, with me standing as close to our subject as possible. For this shot, I've zoomed in halfway and I'm now standing further back from our subject to maintain the same framing that I was when we were zoomed out. And in this final shot, I'm zoomed all the way in and I'm standing even further back to keep that same framing again. As you can see, the more we zoom in, the wider the aperture becomes to maintain the exposure as we change focal length. The result is we get that shallow depth of field we're looking for. So now we've introduced some really cool shallow depth of field to our shot. However, there are a few things to be mindful of. One, obviously we're having to stand quite far back from our subject. In the case of I Hear Jazz in Central Park, this was perfect because we were going for that kind of Safdie Brothers filming from afar, kind of fly on the wall look, which obviously if you're far away zooming in on something is perfect. And it also means that if you've got people around on the street who aren't extras and are just real people going about their business, it draws less attention to the camera being there. The other thing we need to be really mindful of is camera shake. When we're shooting this zoomed in, and especially if we're doing handheld kind of tracking shots, all the micro movements of holding the camera are going to be really obvious and really big on screen. Like I mentioned earlier, we have really good stabilization on this camera, and a lot of the time that saved the day and really made these shots usable, but we did still end up having to do a few bits of stabilization in post. So basically when you're shooting, just be really mindful of how still you keep the camera and be prepared to do a bit of stabilization in post if you've got kind of tracking shots zoomed all the way in. So you've shot your footage, you watch it back, it's all right, okay? It's okay. But we want to go further than that, right? We want to get something really cinematic. And a lot of the magic really is going to be introduced when we sort out the colors, when we sort out the color correction, the grade, the exposure. And so we're going to go ahead, go into Davinci Resolve, and I'm going to show you a few different grades and a few ways that I would tackle this footage. I did find that with this camcorder particularly, especially on automatic settings, it does tend to kind of creep towards the overexposed kind of region. However, something started to happen with the highlights as they started to clip and kind of become overexposed. Because of the way the dynamic range is, it kind of had this sort of 16mm filmic look to it, which I thought was oddly pleasing. And I think with the right grade and with a bit of bloom and a few kind of bits of film emulation and whatnot, I think it's actually going to really add to our look. Looking at the footage, there's two approaches I think I want to take here, and I'm going to show you both. One is going to be to clean up the footage, to go for a kind of modern 35mm inspired kind of Kodak 2383 grade, kind of like the Bear, you know, quite a sort of conventional cinematic modern grade. The second is essentially doing something I like to do, which is if I'm faced with a kind of a drawback, let's say in this case, some of the shots are edging towards overexposed, I like to take that limitation and kind of use it as an asset and lean into it, right? I think quite often you have a lot more fun if you just kind of have a sense of play and go towards the things which are kind of holding you back. And in this case, I think we can kind of lean into that and go for a more 16mm kind of, you know, crushed film look that will be more stylistic. So now we're here in Davinci Resolve. I've gone ahead and selected a clip that I want to work with today and that we're going to be using for the tutorial. This was shot for I Hear Jazz in Central Park, and I think it kind of has a lot going on. It's got a nice kind of vibe to it. If I press play, you see we've got this kind of handheld look of these people walking around the city, and then we have a little zoom into the Radio City Music Hall sign. And I think colour-wise there's a lot going on, and we also have that kind of slight overexposed look that I was talking about to work with. So let's go ahead and try out these two different grades. So for the first grade, we're going to go for that kind of more modern 35mm inspired clean look. And to do this, we're just going to go ahead and create a couple of nodes. So if I press Alt S on Windows, I can create some nodes, and I'm going to say we're going to want one for color space transform. We're going to make one for corrections, one that we're going to apply a LUT to, and then we're going to have a grade and kind of end points, and then we're going to have a vignette just at the end here. And I'm going to go ahead and move these nodes down just so we can kind of visualize our workflow. And I'm also going to go ahead now and label all of these just so we can keep track. So we've gone ahead and created our nodes. The next thing to do is to start with the grade. This first look is going to be built around a LUT that's included in Davinci Resolve that emulates Kodak 2383 film print stock. So if we come up to LUTs here, you see under film looks we have a whole load of LUTs which are basically included for free, and I like to use the Kodak 2383 D60. But to use this LUT, we're going to need to change the output gamma of our footage to Cine on Film Log. We can do this by coming to our first node, CST, coming up to Effects, searching for and selecting Color Space Transform. We can go ahead and drag this on. Now essentially what we're going to do here is take our input color space, input gamma, match these with the camera, and then set the output gamma to Cine on Film Log. In this case, the input color space and input gamma are the same as our timeline. If you're unsure, most automatic camcorders probably going to be shooting in something like Rec 709, which is probably the most common color space. So we could also, if you see, go to Rec 709, and that's what we are set to by default. Once you've set up your input color space and input gamma of your camera, we're going to go over to output gamma and change this to Cine on Film Log. So we come down to our list here, as you see, Cine on Film Log, click on it, and as you see, this then transforms our footage. And we now have that log look, and this is now in the correct format to work with the LUT that we're going to be using. To apply the LUT, let's go ahead and click on our LUT node here and select our Kodak 2383 D60 emulation. Press Apply LUT to Current Node, and just like that, we've now applied the LUT. But as you see, we're slightly kind of blown out here. We have the highlights that are kind of too much, so we're going to need to do some color correction here. As you see, we've made our correction node here, which is where we're going to be working to kind of change our exposure, our white balance and things like this. Make sure that you're using a node before your LUT instead of afterwards. So let's go ahead and bring down the gain here. And as you see, as we do this, and get, let's say, somewhere like here, the colors already are looking really nice. Now this is where we'd also make white balance and tint adjustments if we needed to. So we could, for instance, make this a bit cooler and go for a kind of, slightly cooler look, or we could kind of warm it up. Again, this is down to preference and what you're working with. I'm going to make it slightly cooler and perhaps give it there you go, somewhere like that. In fact, I'm just going to keep on 0 on tint. I'm quite happy with how that looks. But you see, now we have our footage looking pretty good, and we didn't really need to do too much to it. We've just brought down the overall exposure, and we've gone ahead and just corrected the white balance a little bit. If we needed to make any kind of grade adjustments, we could do that on our grade node. In this case, I actually am pretty happy with how this is looking. So I'm going to use this grade node and basically transform it to a film grain node, just so we have the option to add some film grain if we want. So I'm going to come up to effects here, and let's type in grain, film grain. And of course this is optional, but if we select, let's say 35200T, and I'm just going to isolate the grain, and we're just going to tweak a few settings here. So I'm going to bring up the grain strength a little bit, and then I'm going to change the size of the grain, make it slightly smaller, turn it back on, and now we can have a little look and play around with the opacity until somewhere like that. I'm pretty happy with. And it's just small, but it just gives it an extra bit of that kind of filmic quality without overdoing it. So let's go ahead and see where we are. So I'm pretty happy with that. Let's go ahead and add a vignette onto the end. So I'm just going to do this with an effect. We could make a mask, but just for the sake of keeping things easy, I'm just going to literally add on an effect here. And we're just going to tweak these parameters a little bit and change the global blend to something like that. And I'm pretty happy with that. So let's do a little side by side. This was the footage we started with. If I press play, it's going to play through, and then I've just loaded up our grade afterwards. And as you see, it's quite a difference. Now, we didn't have to do too much to this. It was just really a matter of just changing the color space, adding a LUT, doing a few very minor adjustments. And just like that, we've gone from something which just looks like it's shot on a camcorder to something which is looking a lot more cinematic. So that's our first look done. Nice and easy. Let's go ahead and start on the second. So for this next look, we're going to be working with a plugin called Dehancer. Now this is a third-party plugin, and there'll be more information about it in the description below. But this is genuinely the plugin which I've come to use whenever I do film emulation in Davinci Resolve. So I thought I'm just going to show you the workflow that I would use, and so we're going to be using that today. If you don't have Dehancer, you can still follow along, and there are some really great built-in film looks in Davinci Resolve and other plugins available that you could kind of follow along with and match these settings. So for this grade, we're going to go ahead and create 3 nodes. The first one is going to be corrections before, Dehancer, then Dehancer, and then a vignette at the end. Let's go ahead and label these. So we're going to want to go ahead and click on our Dehancer node here and come up to effects, type in Dehancer and drop Dehancer Pro on to our footage. Now, much like the previous grade, it's going to do a color space transform at the beginning of the grade, and as you see, it defaults to Rec 709, which in this case is exactly what we're using, so there's no need to change anything. But like I said with the previous grade, if your camera shoots in a different color space, go ahead and select it from this drop down below. Next up is the film stock. Now, as you see, by default, we're on Kodak Vision Free 250D. I actually like to use, when working with camcorder or working with iPhone footage, there's a film stock I really like the look of, which we're going to be using today. And I may butcher the pronunciation of it, but I'll have it on the screen. It's Agfa Color 100. It's a discontinued film stock, if my research is correct. If it's not, feel free to correct me in the comments. But if we go to the top here, as you see, here's our film stock, and we've gone ahead and selected that. I just really like what this does with the colors, especially when working in Rec 709. The next thing we want to do is come down to print, and here's where we can select print film. Now, we could use Kodak 2383 like our previous grade, but in this case, I'm going to use Kodak Glossy Paper because I really like how it looks. We also now could come back to our film stock and push or pull the grade if we needed to. As you see, the look varies as we slide from side to side. I might leave it just I don't know, like 0.78, let's say, and then we can just continue to work with some settings. I now want to add a little bit of contrast and kind of play with the black and white levels here. So I'm going to come down to the expand tab, and as you see, we can now kind of tweak this a little bit. So I might push this up here, and as you see, that's now crushed our shadows a little bit more, and it's just created a bit more depth and brought the colors out of our image a little bit more. And now that we've done that, I want to go ahead and start adding those kind of film characteristic effects, so the grain, the halation, and the bloom. So we're going to come down to the film grain here, and as you see, by default we're on 35mm. I'm going to go ahead and select 16mm ISO 250, like so, and I might just push this up a little bit to somewhere like 52, and let's just have a look at what that's doing. As you see, we have a really nice film grain applied now, and I'm starting to really be happy with the look of this effect. It's funny how even though it's the same exact shot, suddenly it's looking a lot more kind of vintage and retro, which I suppose is what film emulation would do. But in this case, I think because of the way that we have that handheld footage and the zoom, I think it really lends itself to a kind of 60s New York street film vibe, which I'm really liking for this shot. Let's go ahead and add some halation. So down here we can go and click halation on, and I'm going to change this to 60mm. Now if you wanted quite an extreme look, you could select no remjet, and as you see, that's going to really up our halation, and then you could always dial this in. But in this case, I don't want to overdo it. I'm going to keep it subtle, so I'm just going to put it on the default 60mm setting. And if I turn this off and on, you can see what that's doing to those highlights, like the sign here. If I go ahead and turn it off and on, as you can see, it's adding some really nice natural halation to that. I'm also going to want to go ahead and turn bloom on. I'm going to keep bloom on 35mm for this. I'm becoming aware that as I'm changing these settings, obviously we're kind of losing detail and stuff, which is good for film emulation, but I'm trying to just find that line between nice emulation with that analog warmth and also kind of keeping quality. So as you see, we already have a pretty strong filmic look here. Let's just go ahead and add the last few kind of points on. For the last points, I'm going to add film damage, which I'm going to do by just clicking on film damage and then turning on to 16mm. Usually I'd customize these, but I'm just going to have a little watch through and see if I like how it looks. It looks pretty subtle. I'm happy with it. There's nothing I particularly want to change. I may even turn it up a tiny bit, just to kind of make it a little bit more noticeable, because there's so much going on in the shot. The next thing we're going to want to do is come down to film breath, turn this on, and again we're going to select 16mm, and this is just basically modulating kind of exposure and highlights. I may just turn the period up a bit in the custom just to kind of make it slightly less noticeable. I'm happy with that. And then gate weave we're going to turn on, and I'm going to leave gate weave on 35mm and turn the impact down a tiny bit. So let's just have a watch of what we have here. So although we have a little bit of playback lag due to the heavy processing, all in all I'm very happy with this, and I think this is quite a distinct look and quite different from our previous grade, as you can see. You may want to go in and sort of tweak the colors a bit. We could come onto our correct tab here and we could play around with the color balance. I might want to warm this up a little bit. Perhaps make it slightly, there we go, slightly more natural. I quite like the look of this. It's for some reason giving me Home Alone 2 vibes. I'm also just going to quickly come over to our film damage, and I just want to bring some of these down a bit. So I'm going to bring the dust amount up a little bit, and then I'm going to make sure that the hairs are just white, which I think is just going to sell this a little bit more. Yeah, I'm happy with that. So let's go ahead and do it before and after. So here was our original footage. Let's go ahead and press play, and then you'll see afterwards our 16mm film emulation. And this second look is obviously a lot closer to what I ended up using for I Hear Jazz in Central Park, although in the film I used a two-tone effect, which I can do a separate tutorial on if anyone's interested. But for a general kind of filmic look, I'm pretty happy with this. And this is an example of where I really feel like the way a camcorder shoots really lends itself to film emulation. And in actual fact, if I'm ever emulating film, be it 16mm or 16mm, I always tend to try and shoot on a camcorder, because I just think the end result looks a lot better than shooting on a cinema camera and having to sort of downgrade the footage, if that makes sense. But there we go. That's our grade complete. If you're interested in seeing the final result and seeing how the clips we've worked with fit into the context of an entire short film, I've gone ahead and linked the film down in the description below. It's called I Hear Jazz in Central Park. The entire film was shot with 3 portable cameras, all of them unconventional choices, and as you've seen, a huge chunk of the film was shot with the camera we've been looking at today. If there's any interest, I may do a video on the other cameras as well, because they're quite unconventional choices. One of them was the DJI Pocket 2, I think it was, which is also a very interesting camera to work with and to try and get cinematic shots with. But let me know. So just to wrap up the video, I just wanted to give you a little bit of wisdom and share kind of what this whole process has taught me and what shooting on a camcorder kind of taught me. What's the point of all of this essentially? And I think out of this process, something I've really had validated is this idea that it's not the equipment that's going to make you a better artist. Whilst it's important, and obviously the better gear you have, obviously it gives you more options and more flexibility in a lot of cases. Especially when you're starting out, I think it's really important to remember that you can make an award-winning film on a smartphone, especially nowadays. You know, I think going out there, making something unique, finding your voice as an artist is so much more important than insisting on having the latest camera or the latest equipment or a bigger crew. Because of course these things are important, but a great example I always point to is Sean Baker with the film Tangerine. He shot this film entirely on iPhones and it was selected for Sundance. His next film, obviously, he shot on anamorphic lenses, 35mm film, Willem Dafoe's in it, you know, great cast, great everything. But the point is, he found his style, he found his voice, and he did something different. And so, don't wait till you have an expensive camera. Don't wait until you have the perfect conditions. Just start creating. Just start now, and you may be disappointed. And if you are, that's a good thing, because that means you know what you did wrong. And you can start learning, you can start refining. And quite often, the best way of finding your style is to find what isn't your style, if that makes sense. And so to close this video, and just to reinforce this philosophy, here's a few closing words from Eric Norcross. He's an American filmmaker that I made I Hear Jazz in Central Park with. And this is just a snippet from a conversation we had about not waiting for the financing or the perfect camera, but just starting now.
And everybody was talking about making movies, but nobody was making a movie. And it was frustrating him. And he was in that zone too, where he was pitching. And he just decided, you know what, I'm going to just pick up a camera. My roommate is an actor and he's, you know, he's funny. He can improvise. And so they would just walk around Hollywood creating scenes out of the public and doing a version of what we do. And I loved that idea. And I thought that, you know, in between pitching these bigger projects, why not always just have a camera on you doing something? Because again, this goes back to the first 3 years in New York, right? I regretted not doing anything. I regretted all that time wasted, and it can take a really long time for somebody to commit financing. So why wait and waste that time when you could just be producing something in the meantime? The equipment is there, the willing people are there, and you're in a place where you not only have an incredible countryside, you've got the urban areas too, you've got the coastal areas, so you have this back lot, which is just perfect for creativity. And so, yes, pursue the money, but also don't just wait for it. If you have an art practice, have an art practice.